As Casey mentioned, I've worked in the worship and tech sphere in a few different churches. Um, I've also worked with university students, teaching and mentoring, and I really love this intersection of what I often tell people, the really nerdy side of worship ministry, the tech booth. I really love it. I'm definitely a giant nerd, as I think a lot of tech people are, and I use that term as endearingly as I possibly can. But also love that integration, as Casey mentioned, with worship ministry and music and the amazing things that we get to do. I think we're living in a really cool, even just era, if I can use that term in church history, where we do have more and more of this intersection happening, where we can get really creative with what's happening with our technology and our worship and our music. And so I get passionate about it. I get excited about it. My hope for this evening is that you guys are able to come away from this with some helpful tips. I've tried to orient things so that there's a lot of practical kind of meat in what I have to share with you guys. But also just want to extend the invitation. My goal anytime I get to do something like this is that it's not both the beginning and the end of the conversation, but rather the beginning. So I've got my email on there. I'll throw that back up at the end. But if you guys have specific questions in your context, please feel free to use me as a resource and shoot me a note if there's specific things I can help out with. Um, I titled this, maximizing message, making the most of your worship technology, and I like using that language for one because being kind of on the worship side, I feel like a lot of worship leaders, pastors, ministers like to get into the philosophical side of things, and I definitely have an appreciation for that. I won't spend a lot of time there. But the reason I've called this maximizing message, whenever I talk with my audio students, one of the ways that I like to talk about the craft that we have in audio production, but this also applies to video and other forms of media, is that we're basically doing the work of amplification. And it's a little reductionistic, but I tell them, at its core, all kinds of audio production is it's amplification, and then if you're like sending recordings out, just multiplication. You're just trying to get the message in front of more people. And so again, at a basic level, if I set up a microphone, what I'm doing is I'm taking my voice and I'm working to then digitize that, at least in today's day and age. We digitize it, right? It goes through a bunch of random processing that we can get into, but eventually it's going to come out of a speaker, and that speaker is going to make it louder than it was before so that more people can hear it. Again, really reductionistic. But again, if you're also thinking about like the video production side of things, we have a camera to capture an image. That camera image is going to be viewed somewhere, and maybe in this instance, it's being viewed, several hundred miles away. Or maybe in some context, that image is being put up on a large projector screen. And then we're talking about image magnification and trying to convey something or portray something using technology. And so again, a reductionistic approach, but the reason I've got maximizing message on here is because ultimately I think it's so important in the church to start with message, and to not just start with message and make sure that our message is good and true, right? Yeah, I know you guys are all here because you feel similarly about that we convey a pretty amazing message in church ministry, of yeah, the hope that we have in Christ. But the reason I then have maximizing up there is because I think oftentimes we are limited in our use of technology. We often look at technology as just a tool merely to convey the message. Whereas I rather think using the term maximizing opens up opportunities for us to actually start to evaluate how can we use technology in creative, artistic, inventive ways, not just to merely convey the message, but to actually to maximize it, to maximize its impact, to maximize the number of people it can reach, but also even to maximize some of the elements of the message. In worship ministry and in music ministry, we use music in some pretty creative and inventive ways to try and convey emotions. This is basic music theory, but usually we associate major keys with happiness, right? And minor keys with sadness. And so we're using music strategically to manipulate and kind of maximize that message a little bit. We start to orient that around the lyrics that we're singing, and then we can use music and theory in really creative ways to start to influence how people feel about the things that they're singing. In some similar ways, I really love the notion that we can use technology to actually help, again, go beyond just merely conveying the message, but actually influencing and, for lack of a better word, manipulating. I usually like to use the word stewardship rather than manipulation. How can we steward people towards the right understanding, the right interpretation of the message that we're trying to convey? Hopefully that makes sense. That's as philosophical as I think I'll get tonight, even though I like to a lot of the time. But a couple ideas kind of in this idea of maximizing message that I just want to convey to you guys. I don't know if you've encountered this term before, undistracting excellence. It's a term that I hear in the worship sphere some. I think technically, I think it started with John Piper. Don't quote me on that, but if you're familiar with him and his writings, I think it's originally from one of his articles or something like that. It's one that I've heard a lot of different worship leaders use, and I hear them use it in the context of worship. Like, biblically, we're called to pursue excellence, but oftentimes I hear them talk about in their music and their use of technology. They're often like, well, we want to pursue excellence, but we don't want it to become a distraction. And I think this is a good notion. We don't want the technology, the good use of the technology to become the end in itself, right? And then do you think there are churches, there are ministries that are guilty of some of these pitfalls, right? I like to give the example. I mentioned image magnification, right? The idea of using a camera and then throwing it up on a projector or a TV or something so that people can see a little bit more clearly. If you've ever been to a concert or if you've been to a church that does that, you can probably picture it. It can be a little distracting if you're in a room that only seats like 100 people to do image magnification because it's already a pretty intimate space. There's no need to put somebody's face up there. It may be technically excellent, but it may actually be a little distracting. And so I think there's some good ideas with this framework. But there's a couple pitfalls that I've seen as I've heard people use this framework of undistracting excellence. One of those pitfalls is one of the ones that I already mentioned. We're trying to avoid distracting excellence. We're trying to avoid doing things with our technology just because we can. Maybe that's true in some of your contexts, and maybe there's things like, where, this is where we need to dial back, or maybe we're doing too much with our current mix and we need to pull back, or maybe things are too loud on Sunday mornings, or I don't know. You could probably fill in the blank for a number of examples of distracting excellence, where maybe by traditional standards it's technically excellent, but it's maybe not right in your context. If I had to guess, though, most people that I talk to in sessions like this, are here because they're looking for insight. They want to figure out how can we become more excellent, and so I usually don't see this pitfall so much as I see this pitfall. I think sometimes in church world, we can become so concerned about the distraction that we often fail to actually pursue excellence, and we settle for what I like to call undistracting mediocrity. It's a little bit of a harsh term. So I apologize for the harsh term, but I think it's a powerful one, just because I think, again, biblically, I think God wants our excellence. He's deserving of our excellence. For those of you who might be musicians or ministers, or I think this, that we strive to do what we do at a high level, not to glorify ourselves, but because we want our excellence to be honoring to Christ, right? Honoring to God. But I think oftentimes in the tech world, what I've observed is churches are like, we're not even going to go there. We're not even going to attempt this, whether that's, setting up a new set of choir mics, or, I think pre-COVID, a lot of churches were like, we're not even going to go there with live stream. Then COVID kind of forced our hand a little bit, and we started live streaming a lot more. But there might be certain things that actually would be really beneficial for your ministry, but you're afraid to go there because you're afraid of distraction. And so we kind of settle for, well, kind of as long as there's no fires on Sunday morning and nothing like crazy happens, that's a success on a Sunday morning. Whereas I think oftentimes, as I consult with churches, I encourage them like, hey, let's push in a little bit. Let's take a step further, and really see where we can strive for excellence in some meaningful ways. So I say that again because this idea of maximizing, I want to help you guys figure out some strategies for how you can maximize what you're doing with your worship technology. I think some of that does just start with kind of your philosophy, your framework. If you're viewing your worship technology really as just kind of the necessary evil to amplify the music team, to amplify the pastor when he's preaching on Sunday morning. If you'd be more content to just go without on a Sunday morning, which I'll confess, there's plenty of Sundays where I'm like, man, this would be a whole lot easier if we just didn't have to worry about the technology piece. But if that's the operative mindset that you have for your technology, I just that's where I like to push in with churches and talk about, hey, I think actually this can really be an aid. This can be a tool. This can actually help nuance and inform your not inform, but help you convey your message and communicate your message in new ways. So I usually like to talk about it this way. We're looking not for undistracting excellence, not undistracting mediocrity, but excellence that serves and maximizes the message. So this kind of leads me into kind of a couple more, again, on the philosophical side, a couple principles, kind of pieces of advice, things that I've found success with. But I think if you're thinking through how do we equip our tech teams, how do we really get the most out of our worship technology, I can give you a million different ways to, let me phrase it this way. I can give you a million different pieces of gear to buy, because I love gear and I love talking with people about gear and making recommendations. Oh, you should buy this. But I usually don't feel like that's the best place to start. For one, I don't know that it's always great stewardship to just keep going out and buying new stuff. But I'm also really passionate about like resourcing and equipping, training volunteers. One of the things that I think can take you the furthest in maximizing not only your worship technology but also your tech team, is really equipping them. And that's why I like to kind of start with this idea of maximizing the message. So what I have here, find one or two key volunteers. I'm guessing, I was talking with Casey a little bit yesterday. It sounds like many of you may be kind of that key volunteer. Either you're maybe the pastor at your church or you're the key volunteer. And if you're the key volunteer, congrats, your pastor did this. They found you. But I would maybe nuance this to say, find a couple other volunteers to partner with. I think anytime I've been in a ministry and I feel like everything falls solely on my shoulders in my area of focus, that can be kind of a lonely place to be. And particularly in the tech world, when there's no one else that has shared language for the concerns that you have going into Sunday, you're not able to dialogue with anybody about like, hey, if this happens, I don't know what I'm going to do, or the pastor asked for this, but I have no idea how to get there. I would encourage you to seek out some dialogue partners. The other thing that I would do as you seek out kind of those key volunteers or those key partners is I would talk with this kind of language. You're not there just to support, and again, you're not there just to convey or to help amplify what's happening, but you're actually there to reinforce, to actually creatively serve the message that's being communicated, to serve the music ministry. An example of that. So at my church, so right now I'm in a little bit of a weird space at my church because we're in between worship pastors, and so I'm actually helping lead worship while also doing some stuff on the tech side. So, but I have great conversations with both my tech volunteers and also some of our other worship leaders, and I love talking with them about creative ways that we can maximize the message when we actually bring our volunteers and our worship leaders together. So an example that even came out of a meeting today. We're talking about a message for this Sunday. For our Easter series, we're doing something kind of cool, and we're actually focusing on stories from the Gospel of John after the resurrection, and focusing on, just because I think we don't hear sermons all the time about Christ's in between season of after the resurrection, pre-ascension, right? So this week it's John 20, and we're talking about Mary Magdalene and the tomb, and we were kind of playing around with the idea of there's the darkness. She enters while the tomb was still dark, and then she experiences light when Jesus calls her name. So we started talking, and I was talking with our lead pastor. Oh, it would be really cool if we kind of played around with some of that imagery and actually had our lighting tech even maybe complement some of those things in the message with some lighting cues. Like, what would it look like? And when we haven't landed in a certain spot, I'm not sure that I'm going to make the room pitch black for the first half of the message. But I love those conversations. What would it look like if we actually had the room a little bit darker, and then we actually brought it up as he's reading the passage, and Jesus says Mary, and she snaps around and looks at him, and then the lights came up. That's just a creative example from the top of my head from a meeting I had today. I love having those conversations. And when you find one or two key volunteers and you start to invite them into those conversations, they go from feeling like, oh, we're kind of there because they need us. It's kind of that mentality as a volunteer. I'm here because if I wasn't here, then like the audio thing wouldn't happen, the video thing wouldn't happen, right? But then you go from that to I actually feel like now as a volunteer, I'm a key part of and a key participant in what's happening as we're conveying this message. It helps elevate them from kind of that spot of kind of mediocrity or feeling like, man, I don't know how much I'm really contributing. I'm hitting a couple mute buttons, or I'm hitting the right arrow key in ProPresenter or, Media Shout or whatever presentation software you use. It helps kind of elevate them a little bit. And I think that helps with volunteer longevity. You get more participation out of them. They're more excited about what they get to do, because you're calling them into this idea of, hey, you're actually here to help us, not just help us convey, but help us maximize the message. The other piece here, oh, there I had the nuance, one or two other key volunteers if you are that key volunteer. The other piece that I really do love to invite tech people into is to collaborate in planning worship. Maybe that doesn't mean they're picking songs, but if you do have conversations like the ones that I mentioned, some of those conversations around your liturgy and how the technology can actually help serve the liturgy in some creative ways. I don't know what the liturgy looks like in all of your different churches, but there might be some different things that you could do whenever you're doing communion or baptisms or practicing any of the sacraments, right? There could be different things that you're doing, especially as we are coming up on Good Friday and Easter. Maybe there's some different opportunities for some creativity in your tech. And I think the more you invite your tech volunteers into those conversations, the more that gets them starting to think about some of these things, right? The more passionate they're going to be. The other thing that I would nuance as you are looking for volunteers or partners, if you are that key volunteer, I would really encourage you to look for people who buy into this concept, who are willing to go to those places with you. I've had some really technically excellent audio engineers that are amazing at their craft. They can throw together a mix like nobody's business, and it sounds like I'm at a giant, like a giant, Christian revival concert or something like that. I don't know. You throw in your favorite worship artist. But those volunteers don't want to have conversations about stuff like this. They know how to create an awesome mix, and that's what they want to focus on. They can still be great volunteers on your tech team, but if you're looking for people who are really going to help you on this journey of growing your tech ministry, of growing what your church is able to do as they do intersect that worship side and the technology side. The people that I seek out aren't necessarily the most technically competent people. Sometimes they are if they're willing to go to those places. But I would say that the key volunteers that I usually try to seek out are the ones who really buy in, that are excited about how technology can come alongside your other ministries and really aid what you're doing as a church. Hopefully that makes sense. I think with that, I'm going to get into the more technical side, because I promised Casey, I wasn't just going to talk about philosophy the whole time, even though I probably could. I also could talk about technology and the technical aspects for a really long time. But I only have a little bit longer with you guys, and I want to leave time for questions. So if you're good with that, want to dip into some really practical technical recommendations that I have. Hopefully this hits kind of some helpful pieces for your ministries. So I'll kind of jump in if you guys are good with that. So when I consult with churches, I would say for most tech volunteers, most tech directors on staff, I don't think it's a stretch to say that probably 85% of your role is troubleshooting, putting out fires, figuring out why isn't this microphone working? Why isn't that speaker working? Why isn't this camera working? You can insert a piece of gear or a piece of software into that statement. Why isn't blank working? And I would venture a guess is to say, that's probably again like maybe 80% of what you spend your time doing, at least the challenging parts of your time. And if you're in a context where you're like, actually that's not true for me at all, praise God for that. Because I think, tech ministry it's just a lot of, you're putting together systems and you're figuring out how to keep those systems operating. I would say within that 80% troubleshooting, I would say a large percentage of that really comes down to issues with signal flow, which is my fancy way of saying something isn't plugged in right, or got unplugged or something along those lines. And so as I work with new volunteers again, and as I consult with different churches or worship pastors, directors, usually one of the first things I advise them to look at is the signal flow and to just unpack to understand the signal flow of your systems. I usually like to break this down using the framework ins, processing kind of in the middle, and then out. It's not catchy. I can't think of a cooler word than processing to use in the middle there. But ins, processing, out is the framework that I generally like to use. So let me unpack that a little bit with you guys. So in an audio context, here's some of the things that I mean by ins, right? Our inputs. So things like microphones, direct boxes. If you don't know what a direct box is, it's that little box that a guitar plugs into. So you plug the 1/4 inch in, and then you plug the XLR in to the other end. That's a direct box or DI or direct input. There's a few different names for it. I could go into why we use them, but I won't do that here. But those are some of our basic inputs, right? You've got microphones that you plug in on stage. You've got wireless mics, right? I've got some cable representations here. So, mics plug in using an XLR cable. Guitars use a 1/4 inch or TS or TRS cable. Some other elements of kind of the ins that I like to break down. Depending on your church and your facility, you may have kind of different elements of routing kind of in this ins category. So I often like to break that down as like stage boxes or digital snakes. The console at our church, it's a digital console. We have 3 different digital pieces of gear on stage where we plug in our XLR cables from our microphones. I like to call them stage boxes. A lot of places will call them digital snakes. If you've heard that term snake before, it's a weird audio term. It's basically a device that we can plug a bunch of cables into, and then it's going to bundle it down to one usually pretty thick cable if we're talking about analog snakes. Or if we're talking about digital snakes, usually like a Cat5, Cat6, or Ethernet cable. That's the representation that I have down here, that Ethernet cable. So you might have some of those either analog or digital snakes kind of on stage. The other thing I threw up here is floor pockets. If you had a church that was constructed that actually has like pockets in the stage, those can be fun. I've come into a couple churches where like, I got hired in, and I was like, okay, sweet. Like you've got these floor pockets on there. Like, where do they go? And usually the response I get is, I don't know. Which is fun because those can be hard to trace out and find, okay, where are all the different ends and stuff like that. But again, all kind of in that ins category of inputs, right? You're trying to figure out what are all the inputs that we use frequently. For processing, oh, I threw wireless mics on here as well. Wireless mics are fun. And I say that honestly and also a little bit facetiously because they're also fun to troubleshoot. For processing, usually what's reserved in this category in the audio world would be like your audio console. So again, you might have XLRs running into that. You might have Cat5 or that Ethernet cable. You might have TRS running into that. But processing is kind of that middle category that I like to reserve for, what's doing the heavy lifting, what's controlling the volume, what are you using EQ, compression, like the device that's doing all of that. In most contexts, it's going to be your audio console. Every once in a while, depending on the context, you may have a computer with a digital audio workstation, a DAW, doing something like that, but some different elements there. One of the things that is unique, and I see this a lot as I'm kind of helping worship pastors troubleshoot. If you have a digital audio console, one of the unique things in the digital world is that you can have a digital I/O or input-output patch bay. It looks something like this. This is the one on the D Live, which is a console by Allen and Heath. If you've seen a screen like this on your console, one of the unique things as you're tracking out your signal flow, you might have a microphone plugged into a pocket on stage and it's labeled 3. And you're like, great. It's plugged into 3. That's awesome. And then you trace out that cable and you've got a digital snake somewhere else on the stage that cable run under the stage is plugged into. And now that cable that was 3 in that stage pocket is now plugged into 15 on the digital snake. Why did they plug it into 15? I don't know, but I'm sure they had a good reason for it. And then when you get to your console and you look at your digital patch bay, you're looking at this input over here and you're like, sweet, like that's my input from 15, but it's actually routed to channel 22 on my console. Because with these digital patch bays, you can take any input from your digital snake and route it to any one of your channels. It's one of the nice things because you've got flexibility, but you can also probably see like the potential pitfalls. I like this picture because they've got just this straight line, which usually means 15 corresponds to channel 15 on the console. That's not always the case, but these pretty straight lines are always fun for me to see when I come in. So that's kind of a digital patch bay. It offers an additional point of flexibility, but also an additional pitfall if you don't know where the digital routing is going on your console. And then outs, usually speakers are pretty important output. I've got a couple cable types on there again. So I've got XLR again. I've got Speak-On. Speak-On is that big, heavy blue twist lock connector. If you're familiar with those are kind of fun. And then I've got TRS again as well. Depending on the types of speakers you have, they may use any combination of those. You may have in your outputs category separate amplifiers from your speakers. Those would be passive speakers, and so they have an amplifier that sits probably in a closet somewhere. Then they have a big heavy cable that runs all the way up to the ceiling or a speaker stack or something. Or you might have active speakers that have a built-in amplifier. It just depends on your system. So that's a little bit. You've also got in the outputs category in-ear monitors. I don't know if any of your churches utilize those, but you might have different options for kind of in-ear monitoring so that you can hear things. If you use things like ClickTrack or just want to use use that to hear yourself as a vocalist or an instrumentalist. Some different things there. The other thing that I didn't throw in there is like broadcast mix. So if you have a live stream, like how are you getting your audio into your video broadcast? Different things to think about. So again, in this ins processing outs framework, this can also be applied to other AVL systems. So to apply it to video real quick, your ins in a video system generally are going to be your cameras. You may also have some different signal converters. This is a BNC or SDI connector. One thing that's interesting is HDMI isn't great over long distances. Usually it's pretty reliable up to like 30-ish feet. Anything longer than that, usually you have to do some kind of form of conversion to get the full quality signal. So you might have a converter in there. Blackmagic makes some great ones where you convert it to an SDI signal or a Cat5, Cat6, that same Ethernet cable. There's some converters that do that as well. You also might have your presentation computer. Maybe that connects using HDMI, or maybe it's VGA, or one of the other many ridiculous video connectors that they've used through the ages, like DVI or S-Video, or I would say hopefully if you've got a newer device, you're probably using HDMI as the output, but sometimes it just depends. Processing. Oh, I threw this in there just as an example of like what I mean by like presentation computer. This is ProPresenter. If you're familiar with that, there's lots of other great presentation softwares. This is the one that I like to use, that my church uses. But there's also some other great ones out there like Proclaim, Media Shout. Video switcher. This is kind of the meat, the processing. This is what's doing the heavy lifting in our video systems. Really here, I'm thinking a lot about broadcast. So again, COVID kind of forced our hand. My guess is, as most of your churches are probably doing at least some kind of form of live streaming or broadcast. Oftentimes the video switcher is going to do some heavy lifting for that. This would be like a physical video switcher. This is the Blackmagic ATEM Mini. It's got different HDMI inputs in the back. It's got some different buttons, and you can switch between those different video streams. Oftentimes, the multi-view looks something like this, where you have a preview bus and a program bus. You hit a button, it pulls up that camera on the preview, and then you hit usually auto or cut, and that basically uses a preset transition to switch what's on the preview over to what's on the program. That's a really basic look at kind of a video switcher setup. You also may be using software like OBS. I don't know if any of you guys are using OBS. It's open broadcast software. If you don't have a physical video switcher, this is a software video switcher. And so rather than plugging into a physical device, you plug into a computer, and then you do your video switching on the computer. Down here in the bottom right, this is OBS. They're using it in this picture in collaboration with like Media Shout so that they can get their lyrics overlaid on top of their live stream. So some cool flexibility with programs like OBS. Again, that's open broadcast software. Your outs in a video system, usually your projector. That's the main one, or TV in most contexts. Connect using HDMI or VGA. If you're really lucky, you might have an SDI input on your projector. But my guess is you're probably using one of those. But then other elements. So again, broadcast. If you are doing a live stream, usually that's sent to your website or your platform for your live stream using something called an RTMP stream. It's a real-time messaging protocol. So usually that looks something like this. I think this is the YouTube stream settings. But again, if you've been doing this for a little while, this is probably familiar to you, where you often have a stream key, which is like almost like a password to keep your live stream secure, and then a stream URL. That's basically like, this is where we're sending our video. And so it uses that RTMP stream to get your video content up on YouTube or Facebook or Vimeo or something like that. Sorry, I'm going pretty fast here, but like I said, I could talk about technical stuff for a really long time. My recommendation in all of that, to go through the ins, processing, outs, is to give you this idea. One of the first things I recommend for churches to do is to create a signal flow chart if you don't have one already. This can be a pretty arduous process depending on how complex your church's system is, depending on how much you already know about it. But what I mean by a signal flow chart is basically mapping out those ins, processing, and outs. What are all of our inputs, all of the different microphones we have, the different devices that we plug into on stage? What's our audio console? Where are all the cables running from that? And then, our outputs, mapping all of that out, and then trying to figure out how they all connect to one another and trace out, if I plug in a microphone here, that signal is then going to this box, that box is going to the console. All of this mumbo jumbo is happening on the console. And so then that's going to our speakers somehow. That's going to our broadcast somehow. That's going to our monitor wedges on stage or in-ear monitors. The signal flow chart is basically a way for you to just kind of go through that exercise of figuring out, how do these inputs, these ins, this processor, this big device in the middle, and how do all these outputs connect to one another? So just to give you an example of that, This is a pretty simple one that I did for my church. Again, this could get a lot more complicated if I wanted it to. But some basics for the ends, I've got some microphones on stage. They're plugging into three different boxes. I've got one stage box and I've labeled it stage box one that has 16 inputs. So I've got stage box one, 1 through 16. I've got some other microphones plugged into a second stage box, which is stage box two, also has 16 inputs, right? And then I have what I've dubbed my stage rack. There's all sorts of nomenclature for this stuff. Whatever term you use to refer to it is totally fine. I called it a stage rack that has 64 XLR inputs. And so I've got microphones on stage plugged into all three of those using an XLR cable, which I color coded yellow. We've also got wireless mic receivers, those boxes that sit in a rack that the wireless mics connect to. They're often hooked up to antennas as well to receive those radio signals. They have an XLR output on the back, and those are plugged into my stage rack. Okay. Cat5, that Ethernet cable, is connecting these stage boxes to the stage rack. The stage rack then connects to our audio console that's back at front of house. So we've got a big long Ethernet cable running underneath the floor in our auditorium that's connecting there. And then I've got on my outputs, I've got that stage rack again. What's interesting in the way I have it represented here is the stage rack here, stage rack here. It's actually the same device. I've just separated out that stage rack and my inputs on the stage rack 1 through 64 from my outputs on the stage rack 1 through 32. So you can represent that a couple different ways. I've seen people do it where they just draw the stage rack once and then they just have this blue arrow and it's kind of going in both directions where you've got inputs coming in, outputs going out, however you want to represent it. But that stage rack then connects via XLR to our amplifiers. The amplifiers connect via speak-on to our speakers. We also have Cat5 cables coming from our stage rack to our in-ear mixers on stage so that our musicians can mix their own ears and plug in headphones and hear click and stuff like that. Again, simple representation, but hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of the exercise. I'll walk through a video one here. Do I have a video one? I thought I did. Video one would be pretty similar. Shoot, I thought I had one in here. That's all right. But video one, you would trace out your cameras. Maybe your cameras are at various points, in the auditorium, various places. Like I mentioned, HDMI only goes so far. So like in our setup, we have our HDMI converted to SDI. So we've got little converters in that input category. So it's HDMI from the camera into the converter, then SDI to our video switcher, which would be in that processing category, right? And then we have SDI going out to our live stream encoder that's doing that RTMP stream. So again, I don't mean to get into all of the technical weeds, but it's just this idea of basically tracing cables, trying to figure out, okay, here's where this is coming in, here's where it's eventually going out, what's everything that happens in between to create a signal flow chart. The next thing that I would do as a key volunteer yourself, but also maybe in collaboration with a couple other key volunteers, is I would reset your stage. What I mean by this, don't do this right before Easter. That would be unfortunate. But maybe post Easter, take some time, do this on a Sunday afternoon or a Monday where you've got plenty of time to reset things for the next Sunday. But what I mean by this is unplug everything and plug it back in the way that you want it to be plugged in. This is great to do after you've done your signal flow chart because your signal flow chart is going to give you an idea of how everything at least is currently connected and how it could connect. You might discover things along the way. I gave that example earlier of we're plugging into 3 in the stage pocket, then it's plugged into 15 on the stage rack, and then it's 22 or 21 on the digital console. It would be great if it was 3 when you plugged in on stage and 3 when you plugged it into the stage rack and 3 when it's plugged into the console. You might discover things like that along the way, like why were we doing it this way? Let's make more sense of this. Resetting your stage is an opportunity to do that. The other thing that I would do in the process is create a stage plot. So have conversations with your worship leaders, your musicians, to develop something where you have a representation of this is where stuff plugs in on stage. And then along with that, create an input list. I want to give you an example of this. So this is, again, a pretty simple one, but over on the left, I've got my stage plot. Over on the right, I've got an input list. Um, Basically, I just have represented, here's where my drums would go at this point on the stage. They're going to be plugged into box one, whatever that means. Again, I think I base this loosely off of what we have at our church. But it's going to be plugged into box one, and it's taking up inputs 1 through 8 on there. And you can see on my input list on the right that I've got kind of parceled out. Here's kick, snare top, snare bottom, tom one, tom two, tom three, overhead left. This isn't a very long list because that would be some very small text for you guys to read on this slide. But you kind of get the idea. It's plugged, they're all plugged into box one, and they're taking up these inputs. And then when you look at the channel, maybe it's not 1-to-1 and they don't correspond perfectly, but then I've at least got a reference point in a spreadsheet somewhere. Okay, I plugged my kick into box one, input one on stage, but then that's going to correspond to channel 9 on my audio console. That input list is going to be, kind of your yeah, it's your fallback when you don't know where something's plugged in, because you always think you'll remember and you never remember. So use that input list, create an input list so that here's where stuff at least is supposed to be plugged in. So again, all three of those kind of come together. Reset your stage, and then in the process, create your stage plot, create your input list. Those are going to be great resources. I do have a video example here in this one. This is a little simpler, but it might be good to have a visual representation of where your different cameras are, so that if you have a camera operator coming in or a video switcher, they know, okay, like camera one is placed here in the center. That's getting a center wide shot. Camera two is also in the center. That's getting a center close shot. So a close up of maybe the lead pastor, something like that, the preacher. Maybe you've got a camera on the left, camera on the right. Those can zoom in and out as needed. And maybe you've got a camera on stage. Maybe also in your video switcher, you've got your lower thirds for like lyrics, and that's coming from ProPresenter software. Maybe you're doing some video playback from a device like a Blackmagic HyperDeck. Again, all hypothetical examples. But those are some of the things that I would go through the process with your audio system, with your video system. If you have a pretty complex lighting system, I would take that step and go ahead and cover that as well. Lighting, I've found, can vary a lot depending on the church. It can be the most complicated part of the whole thing, or it can be the simplest part of the whole thing. My last church, our lighting was flipping light switches to turn on and off different fluorescent rows. So it was pretty simple and not at all elegant. But if we were doing communion and we wanted the lights down, I'd lean back from the audio console and flip a few switches behind me. And so just kind of depends on your setup. So those are some different recommendations. But I want to talk about a couple other aspects here, unrelated to signal flow. So some other ideas related to kind of this idea, kind of investing in creativity, technique, and philosophy. So this kind of, again, a little less technical, but more like volunteer resourcing. One of the things I would do kind of after you get the signal flow figured out, you feel really good about your systems, you know how to troubleshoot them, is spend a day establishing home base. What I mean by this, on the audio side, I would spend some time, if you have the capability to play back tracks, or even if you do it, like if your band just does like a jam session day, or like, hey, we're doing a longer practice this week or something, bring in all of your audio people and spend some time with them working to develop a mix that's going to work in your space. This can be really helpful. And what I mean by home base, then, if you have a digital console with the ability to save like a preset, save that preset and then recall it every week. I think this is a really fun thing to do collaboratively. It's great working with other audio engineers, other musicians, to be able to listen to what's coming out of the speakers and kind of figure out, okay, this is what we want this to sound like. We want the drums to be at this level and to kind of have this timbre, this sound. We want our guitars to sound this way. But then establish home base, save that file, and then if you have the ability flexibility, save a backup of that file, and then save a third backup of that file, and then copy that one to a flash drive, and store it in a locked safe in your house or something like that. Have backups, so that you've got that as a starting point. Whenever I'm working with volunteer audio engineers, I usually like to establish this home base in collaboration with them. But then I instruct them, because they're my volunteers. Hey, I want you to recall this every Sunday or every Thursday when you come in for rehearsal. Like, this is going to be our starting point every week. I've been in some contexts where engineers would like always start from the last week's session. Truthfully, I'm not a huge fan of kind of starting where we were last week, because what I find is my mix gets more and more cluttered over time. It's always good, I think, to have kind of a basic starting point, and then that's always forcing me to then kind of listen with new ears each week, make the adjustments that I need to week after week, rather than just kind of relying on what I did the previous week. Because maybe I wasn't feeling great the previous week. Maybe I had a cold and couldn't hear anything. So just kind of helpful. The other thing that you can sometimes do, depending on your church, and I've seen churches do this, I've done this for churches, is depending on your philosophy and your resources, you can hire someone to come in and build home base for you. I know people who love the church, who are really gracious. Here in West Michigan, we have a lot of churches. I think like at one point they were in a record book for like most churches on a single street or something like that. It was crazy. We also have a lot of big churches with professionally trained audio engineers. And so as I've networked with some of them and as I've talked with some of them, I know some of them are really passionate about wanting to help out with churches that maybe don't have the same amount of resources or training that their larger churches have. And so they're really passionate. They like to go into these churches. Sometimes they'll even do it pro bono, but I'm a big fan of, like, if you have the resources to pay somebody to help you with something, it's good to do that. But they'll go in and they'll help work with those volunteers, collaborate with the worship pastor, and come in during a rehearsal, or maybe they're there all week and they're there for rehearsal and Sunday morning, but come in, mix the service, save that preset for you so that becomes home base for you. The other thing that I would recommend is invest in training for your volunteer team. I think there's a few different ways to do this. One of them is through conferences. Got a couple examples here. Philo is a big conference in Chicago every year. I know that's a lot closer for me than it is for you guys. But it's great. It's not only a good opportunity to see kind of what gear is out there, but there's some really good training and resources. A lot of churches in our area will send multiple volunteers down, like their whole volunteer team will go. CFX is another one. I don't know that that's much closer. This last year, I think it was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. But it's interesting. It's a church facilities conference, but they have a section of it and a lot of tech sessions as well. So kind of interesting. There's resources online. Get MXU is a great resource with tutorials. There's mixing tutorials and stuff like that, and also like some video recommendations and some good resources there. And then hands-on training when you can. That same scenario that I mentioned of if you hire someone to come and build home base for you, it can be really great if they come in and then they also have that opportunity to train your volunteers. And if as they're building that base mix, or if it's, I keep using the audio example, maybe it's a video producer who's coming in and tweaking all of your cameras and dialing in your color and working with your video switcher to try and optimize it in some different ways. If they can train your volunteers while they're doing that for you, then it's like win-win. Then you're not only getting kind of that base point, that home base, but you're also training and equipping your volunteers in the process. So kind of cool. All right, and then my favorite part, purchasing new gear, because like I said, I love gear, and I could tell you a lot about how to purchase new gear, but some philosophies here. Know when it's time. What I mean by that, there's usually a few criteria I look for when I feel like it's time to purchase new gear. To go back briefly to why I like using the maximizing language. I don't actually love purchasing new gear. I say that I get pretty excited when that Amazon box shows up. But good stewardship for a church, don't buy new gear if you don't need it. If you're not currently using your existing gear to the best of your ability, if your volunteers aren't trained well on your existing gear, and that's why you're experiencing some issues, then I don't think it's time to buy new gear. I think it's investing in your volunteers. It's maybe kind of doing some additional research, some additional training, but sometimes you do reach those limitations. And so usually, when it's time to buy new gear, there's a few criteria I like. If it's actively breaking or failing, that's usually a pretty good indication. So if something's really unreliable, if you have if let's say you do have a computer that's running OBS, that open broadcasting software. If it keeps crashing because the computer is, more than 5 years old, maybe eventually when you have the resources to do it, it's time to buy a new computer or a dedicated video switcher or something like that. That's an easy one. I would say kind of the next criteria, maybe it's not breaking, but you do feel like you're maximizing its utility and it's got things that it can't do that you want to do. So a great example of that would be if you have an older audio console or maybe a smaller audio console and your ministry has been growing and you're like, you know what, there's things that we'd like to do, maybe with some effects or compression or some processing, or maybe just this current console doesn't have enough channels and our worship ministry has grown and so we need more channels. It may mean the gear isn't breaking, but it's not capable of the ways that you want to grow or the ways that you want to continue to pursue excellence in your tech ministry. Then it's great to buy new gear. The other thing, and this is a little harder to measure, is if your volunteers, if the gear you have isn't conducive to your volunteers being able to use it effectively. What I mean by that is some gear is more volunteer friendly than others. If you have gear that's continually causing stress, if every Sunday you're going in terrified that your volunteer isn't going to know how to do this one thing and it's really complicated to train them on and reliably get new volunteers to do consistently, some gear is like that and it's just not super user friendly. And so I think that's another scenario. The next question then is if you know when it's time, you need to know what to buy. Some good resources there. If you have an audiovisual integrator nearby that you can build a relationship with, that's usually my first stop. There's also national audio visual integrators. One that I know does stuff in a lot of different states, at least kind of here in the Midwest, but I think they're out your direction as well, as like Houseright. But there's a number of them. But an integrator is someone who not only can recommend the right gear, but they'll often come to your church, they'll take a look at your systems, they'll make a specialized recommendation for you, often with different packages, and then they'll actually install it for you a lot of the time. So a great resource. You can also, if you're good installing the gear yourself or you don't have an integrator that you're using currently, you can also talk to a retail sales rep. Here in the Midwest, we love Sweetwater. I think most people in the US love Sweetwater, at least if they're in the tech world. I have the lovely advantage of it's only a few hours drive from me. But they're great if you haven't bought anything from Sweetwater, especially for audio gear. They're really wonderful. They've got some great sales reps. They work with houses of worship all the time, so they make some really good recommendations as well. For video stuff, you've also got B&H Photo Video, which I think that one's based out of New York City. They've got some great reps as well. If you need used gear, you can also go to churchgear.com. That's one of the more reliable places I've seen to get used gear. A couple other things as I wrap up these last couple minutes. I'm good to stay however long if you guys have questions. So I apologize that I can be long-winded sometimes. But couple last recommendations. I would build an asset/anticipated needs list. This takes time, but what I mean by this is gear does need to be replaced eventually. If there's something that you can buy and it's just going to work forever, I haven't found it yet. And so it's good to know how long a piece of gear is going to last and to anticipate when it is going to need replacement. That allows you to be much more proactive in talking with, your board or your leadership or your stakeholders to say, hey, in 3 years, we're going to need a new audio console because ours was purchased at this point and it's near the end of its life cycle. And so some different life cycles, usually good speakers, amps or lighting systems, you're looking at 10 to 20 years. So a longer life cycle. cycle. I really love the speakers that we have at my church. I didn't buy them, but I came in and I was like, sweet, like those are some solid speakers. And so I know we've probably got at least another 10 years before we need to look at replacing them. 10 to 15 years for a sound console. Again, I think that's if you buy one that really does suit your needs. And then all other gear, I would say something in the ballpark of 8 to 10 years. If you're buying something that's under like that maybe 7 or 8 year mark, then I would start to ask like, was that really the gear to buy? And then kind of with my last point here, reasonably buy quality gear. I'll leave you with this nugget. I've had a lot of conversations with pastors, with executive pastors, with solo pastors, lead pastors at various churches, some of them my own, where oftentimes you get that question, okay, we need to buy something. And then I give them a list of options and they're like, whoa, this is way more expensive than I thought it was going to be. And so we go for the cheapest option. I would just kind of pose this question to you guys. Oftentimes, I feel like good stewardship is buying something that's not exorbitantly expensive, but also something that's really going to last, something that's going to equip your volunteers well, that's going to allow you to really move the ministry forward, and that you're also not going to have to replace in 3 years. I had this conversation recently. We were looking at buying a new audio console, and we knew we needed one. My executive pastor found a used one online, and was like, "Hey, what about this one? It's only a couple $1,000s because audio consoles are expensive." And I told him, I'm like, actually, that one, it's an old console. It probably was manufactured about 20 years ago. It's probably being sold because someone is upgrading. And I feel like if we buy that, we're probably only going to get like 2 to 3 years out of it. And at that point, I would rather spend closer to $5,000 or $6,000 to get something really solid, that we know we're going to be able to use for 10 to 15 years. It's going to hurt more now, but it's going to pay off for us later. So that's kind of one other piece that I would throw out there. I wish I had more time to unpack that, but just kind of some different nuggets, some different pieces. Um, this kind of goes in with that last point. Also try to buy things and install things that are volunteer friendly. That kind of goes in with that last point. If it's quality gear, you also want it to be volunteer friendly. You're gonna want to be able to train and equip them on that gear as well. Sorry to race through the tail end there, but I've got my email up there. Feel free to shoot me any questions. If you'd like the presentation as well, I'm happy to email that to you. If you just shoot me a note, I'll pass it right along.